not something that was devised by Hamas, although I often see it quoted as if Hamas made it up because it's in the Hamas charter. But actually, you will find this quotation in the canonical Hadith collections, that is, reports of Muhammad's words and deeds that are considered authoritative for Islamic belief and practice. And consequently, it is a central aspect of Islamic belief that what the tradition actually says is the last day will not come until Muslims kill Jews. And so if any Muslim wants to bring about the last day, the judgment day, the consummation of all things, the end of the world, if any Muslim wants to bring that about, he can kill Jews and that will help bring it about. So this creates the idea that killing Jews is not just a matter of politically trying to gain an advantage over Israel and ultimately destroy it. It is an eschatological and spiritual imperative, and it is nothing less than an act of worship, as Hamas has said on more than one occasion, that Allah has made killing Jews an act of worship for them. And so this is not something that is peripheral or will end with some kind of negotiated agreement. This is a war that will continue as long as there are people who believe in Muhammad and Islam and the Quran.
So let's go back a little bit before that. Let's go back to Hajj Amin al-Husseini, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, meeting with Hitler. And in that historical context, too, around that same period, the forming of the Islamic Brotherhood, the Muslim Brotherhood. So can you talk about these two things in the earlier 20th century, which kind of lead up to what we're seeing in Hamas today?
Absolutely, yeah. The Muslim Brotherhood, it must be understood, was formed in order to create a global Muslim state. Now, it might seem totally fanciful and absolutely beyond belief that anybody would think, yes, we're going to unify all the Muslims in the world into one, excuse me, into one big mega state. And it's likely never to happen. But that is the goal of the Muslim Brotherhood because of the idea of the caliphate. The caliphate is the global Muslim community, the political entity to which all Muslims must belong according to Islamic law. The caliph, the word caliph, khalifa, means successor. And the successor, the caliph, is the successor of Muhammad as the political, military, and spiritual leader of all the Muslims worldwide. After Muhammad, there was the period of the four so-called rightly guided caliphs. Then there was the Umayyad Caliphate, the Abbasid Caliphate, the Ottoman Caliphate, and all of those claimed, although of course in practice none of them attained it, but all of them claimed to be the single global government for all Muslims worldwide. Now, in 1924, the secular Turkish government abolished the caliphate. And this is where all the jihad terror groups in the world, Al-Qaeda and ISIS and Hamas and Hezbollah, every last one of them, they say that's where our troubles began. Because the Muslim world was thrown into a disunity that limited its power. And what we need to do is reunite the Islamic world, restore the caliphate, and then we can wage jihad against Israel and the rest and destroy the enemies of Islam. So in 1928, 4 years after the abolition of the caliphate, the Muslim Brotherhood was founded in Egypt in order to restore the caliphate. It has obviously not succeeded yet in doing so, but it is now a global movement and is working all around the world to attain this goal. Hamas is part of the Muslim Brotherhood, calls itself the Muslim Brotherhood for Palestine. And so theoretically, Hamas is not even working for a Palestinian state. It is working to make Israel, to destroy Israel and make the area in that Israel inhabits be part of the Islamic world again, so that it will ultimately be part of the global caliphate that the Muslim Brotherhood wants to establish. Now, this means that every jihad terror group is working in the same way in various countries around the world, not just to commit acts of mayhem and terrorism for their own sake, but to weaken and destabilize the governments of the various states in which they're operating so that they can be destroyed and a Muslim government put in their place. And ultimately, the idea would be to unite all these Muslim governments into one under the restored caliphate. So Hamas has to be understood as being part of this global movement. And that not only means that the Palestinian struggle, the jihad, becomes a global imperative, as we are seeing particularly since October 7th, but also that all the other Muslim states have a certain obligation to fight against Israel, against the Israeli state, and try to destroy the Israeli state as the vanguard of this global effort to reunite the Muslim communities into one single ummah.
So are all of the academics, the leaders of our universities, the leaders of our governments, the leaders of half of Europe, are they just fools who fall for these lies? Or do you think there's something else at play?
Yeah, they're fools who falls for. There are, in other words, there is a large number of fools who fall for these lies, but there are also many who are bought, because if you look at the donations to American universities, some of the leading American universities, Harvard, Georgetown, MIT, the list goes on and on and on, and also lesser universities, they're getting millions and millions of dollars from the government of Qatar. Now, what is also the government of Qatar involved in? Sponsoring the Muslim Brotherhood. It's the chief state sponsor of the Muslim Brotherhood in the world today. And so you've got this Muslim Brotherhood supporting entity that harbored and still harbors probably the Hamas leaders who are surviving. Remember them celebrating in Doha when they saw the October 7th attacks unfolding. And they are funding American universities. And so when Qatar gives money, they expect you to give them the results. They're buying something. And what they're buying is not disinterested academic inquiry. What they're buying is support for the Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas. And the portrayal of these things not as this imperialistic effort to destroy non-Muslim states and create a global Islamic entity, as I just explained, but they situate it in terms that the American left can understand, that these are the oppressors and these are the oppressed. The Israelis are oppressing the Palestinians. If you're on the side of the oppressed peoples of the world, the indigenous peoples of the world against white settler colonialists, then you have to support the Palestinians. It's all nonsense, and none of it actually applies in this case, because the Israelis are not white settler colonialists by any stretch of the imagination, but are actually the indigenous people of the land. But none of that is taught in the universities. This propaganda point that coalesces with what is being taught in the universities, and the university's tendency toward Marxism is being taught, and that's why it all is being played out today, starting from the university campuses. Those are the epicenters of the Qatari funding.
I think you bring up an excellent point about the money, and also even the Marxism. You know, Marxism is a materialist philosophy, as is capitalism. They both essentially say that people care about their material world. And it strikes me that it is that whether you're talking about the socialist leaning leadership or whether you're talking about the capitalist leaning leadership, both are somewhat ill-prepared to accept that there's an ideological motive not related to the physical world, not related to lifestyle or ownership or having a great economic situation.
Yeah, there's an ideological motive that's completely ignored. That's really what's so amazing to me, even after all these years, that every last communique from Mahmoud Abbas, from the Hamas leaders, from Palestinian Islamic Jihad, from Hezbollah, from Iran, they all mention Islam. When they talk about Israel, they talk about Islam. They understand Israel in an Islamic context that I have tried to explain here in brief. that Israel is an insult to Islam, an affront to Islam, because any land that belongs to the Islamic world at any time belongs by right to the Muslims forever. That's a concept that's based on the Quranic statement, drive them out from where they drove you out. So, that being the case, every point of their opposition is based on Islam. Iran has no beef with Israel otherwise. Iran has no border with Israel, no border dispute, no economic competition. Why does Iran hate Israel? Because of Islam, because of the Islamic imperative. It's an Islamic republic. And so they read the Quran. It says, drive them out from where they drove you out. They think, well, we have to destroy Israel because that was Islamic land. I'm not even talking about 1948. I'm talking about the Ottoman Empire and the conquest by the Arabs of the area that is now Israel in the 7th century. And because it was ruled by Islamic law, it belongs to them forever. So all that is made very clear, abundantly clear, and repeatedly clear by all the leaders in the Islamic world and all the leaders of the Palestinians. And yet it is the one aspect of this conflict that is completely ignored and never mentioned, not even once, in Washington or in Europe or at the UN, anywhere. They do not discuss the Islamic aspect of this conflict that is so central to the other side. They never mention it. They act like it doesn't exist. At Camp David, in Oslo, every last accord, Islam has no mention, has no role. And so the West is trying to pretend that this is a political dispute that can be solved in the ordinary political ways. And it is not, and never has been. It is a religious dispute that cannot be solved by a political solution. And the religious dispute is consistently, steadfastly ignored by everybody who has ever had a role in trying to solve this problem.
What is the solution then? If people can't recognize it, and if people do not see what it is, what are we supposed to do, the few people who do see it?
Well, I'm sorry to say there is no solution. There is only management of the problem. Because as long as there are believers in Islam, believers in the Quran and Muhammad, there will be people who think they have to wage jihad against Israel and destroy it. If Israel were the size of a postage stamp, there would still be people who thought that. Because the whole thing, they have to drive them out. So, the only thing we can do is manage it. Islamic law teaches you do not wage jihad against an enemy who has more than twice your strength, and you have no chance of winning. That's not just political, that's not just military strength. That's also political strength and the willingness to stand by your principles and not compromise them and give away at the negotiating table what you've won on the battlefield. And so that kind of strength needs to be recovered. Also, there needs to be a certain kind of pressure that can be exerted and should be exerted on the Arab states. After all, Egypt has been paid billions of dollars since the Camp David Accords were concluded in order not to go to war with Israel. And yet the Egyptian government has allowed for a massive spread of anti-Semitic material, including even Mein Kampf, which is a consistent bestseller, throughout their country for decades, in violation of the specific words of the Camp David Accords. The American government can and should exert pressure on Egypt and on Jordan and on every state there that gets American money, which is pretty much all of them, and say to them, look, the Palestinians don't exist. You know it, and we know it. We've been pretending all these years. We're going to stop pretending. You know and we know that the Palestinians were invented by Yasser Arafat and the KGB in 1964 as a propaganda tactic, and it's worked great, but it's over. We're dealing with Arabs here who are not different linguistically, culturally, politically, or religiously from the Arabs of Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan, and only slightly different from those of Egypt. And so you have some refugees. I don't mean the UN's list of refugees, which is the children and grandchildren of refugees and great-grandchildren. I mean, you have a dwindling number of people who actually left in 1948. Now, we're going to leave aside for the moment the fact that the Arab Higher Committee actually ordered the Arabs to leave in 1948, and that the vast majority of those who left were not driven out by the IDF. But leave that aside. Let's take every last one of those people, the surviving elderly people who left in 1948, and call them refugees. Now, they are Arabs. Take them in. Every refugee crisis, every refugee situation that has ever happened in the history of the world has been solved by the people who are refugees going to live elsewhere. And sometimes it may seem unkind and harsh. There were Germans who had lived in Königsberg, and their families had lived in Königsberg for centuries. And then Königsberg was taken after World War II and given to the Soviets. Why? Because the Germans started an aggressive war and lost it. And it's a rule of warfare from time immemorial that a country that starts an aggressive war and loses it may end up losing territory to the victorious countries in order to protect themselves against further such attacks. That's happened everywhere in human history. There are hundreds of examples. I'm giving you Germany after World War II because it's ready to hand, and most people are aware that it happened. You look at a map of Germany in 1939, it's substantially larger than Germany in 1945. Why? Because they started a war and lost it. So, why does this not apply to Israel? Because of this deeply ingrained hatred of Jews that we've been discussing. There's no other reason why Israel cannot and should not control those territories that it won in aggressive wars against it, wars it did not start, but it did not lose. And the Arabs absorbed the Germans who lived in Königsberg. They went to live in Germany, what was left of it. Or they went to live somewhere else. They moved to America, whatever. And nobody's whining about German refugees today. And there's no UN agency calling the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren of those people refugees. Why do the Palestinians get a different treatment? You take them and you call upon those countries to settle them in a peaceful and humane manner and give them gainful employ. And you even fund the operation. So nobody can charge that this is anything inhumane that's being done. Why should this be treated so differently from every other refugee problem if they don't want to live in Israel? Otherwise, if they want to be loyal to the Israeli state, there are plenty of Arabs in Israel now who have no discrimination, no apartheid, none of that nonsense. They have full equal rights with the Israelis. So you want to join the Israeli state? Great. You want to go live in Syria? Great. But you're not going to have your Palestinian state because there are no Palestinians. It's a fiction. We're calling it out.
So this concept, let's call it Palestinianism, is really just a method to really destroy the Jews. It has no real historical roots. You mentioned in your book, if you look at the names
the only reason
of many Palestinians, their last names are referring to countries they come from, like Egypt, like Syria, like the Maghreb.